All. This is Dr. Mubin Sayed from drbean.com. Welcome to one more show. So, we're going to continue our discussion about ashwagandha. Today, we're going to talk about the adaptogenic or anti stress and adaptogenic effect of ashwagandha. It's a very interesting mechanism. So, if I can give you a preview of the mechanism right now, and then we'll get into the actual drawings and look at it. Imagine a cell, imagine a cell which is under stress. And within the cell, there are proteins that are breaking, and these are denatured, and these are disabled, and they're sick, and they're feverish, and they're broken. And then comes something which picks those little broken proteins, puts them together, helps them, and makes them whole, makes sure that they stay integral, they stay healthy. We're talking about inside the cell. Make sure that those proteins stay healthy while the stress is present. And as a result of cells' proteins staying healthy, they would start taking care of the stress as well, and the stress would go away. This is the basic mechanism. Such a fascinating story. So let's look at it. So I have already discussed many of the functions of ashwagandha. So this is just a very quick preview of what we have done. And also a quick preview. This is drbean.com. In the description of this video, there is a link to get access to drbean.com at a very, 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 very reasonable price. So you can actually go here. 97 for lifetime is the best one. But if you want CMEs, you can go for 35 per month or 300 per year. Now, this is the study. Ashwagandha, Withenia somnifera, current research on the health promoting activities, a narrative review. This is not a study, but actually a collection of all the studies and what has been done there. Very good article where they put together all of these things. I'm going to go over some of those later on, but let's now go back to my drawings. I am chomping at the bit to show you my drawings today. So this is the older time. These are gifts for humanity. They're continuing. Ashwagandha, an Indian herb, has been used in India for more than 3,000 years. It is grown in other parts of the world as well. Mostly its root is used, but other parts of the plant are also used. Ashwa means horse. Gandha means fragrance. Ashwagandha, horse, and fragrance. That is the name. The reason it is called horse is because of its effect on the sexual behavior. Now, areas of study. It has been proven to be neuroprotective, and that's what we're going to talk about today, that how is it neuroprotective? Sedative, adaptogenic, and that's what we're going to talk to today, that how is it adaptogenic? Sleep inducer, anti-inflammatory, we've already talked about that, antimicrobial, cardioprotective, anti-diabetic, and a lot more. We have already seen the active components of this, and we've talked about them. So I'm just giving you a quick preview of what we have already done. This was the discussion about the anti-inflammatory effect. Then we did another discussion about the anti-cancer effect of ashwagandha. These were anti-cancer diagrams. And today we are at the adaptogenic effect of ashwagandha. Now, adaptogenic means what? We in our life have, of course, stresses on us, which cause us to be, do you know that stresses, even psychological stresses, can actually cause physical harm? And we'll discuss that today, and we'll see how ashwagandha kind of helps against that. Similarly, the changing environment, the changes in the environment also make us bent out of shape. Not physically bent out of shape, but psychologically. And that also causes stress. So ashwagandha is an adaptogenic. What it does is it helps us become adapted to the changes in the surroundings and environments and conditions, and to help reduce the stress. So, for example, the studies that I would mention later on, in those studies, mice who were given shock on their feet, when they had ashwagandha, their stress levels from the shock were reduced compared to those mice that had the shock and didn't have the ashwagandha. So let's continue. Adaptogenic effect is what we're going to talk about. So the way ashwagandha works. So I'm going to start with the superficial high level activity, and then I'm going to dig deeper. You may not have seen such a beautiful rabbit hole before. So metabolic regulator is what is the function of ashwagandha. What that means is that the molecules of ashwagandha get into our body and they go at the cellular level and help regulate various metabolic outcomes to help reduce the stress. In this process, ashwagandha acts as an antioxidant and it acts as an immunostimulant. Now, I want to put one seed in your thought right now. When we are under stress, we release corticosteroids or we release cortisol. And you may have known through this COVID pandemic that steroids are sometimes given for controlling inflammation. So, steroids modulate the inflammatory system or immune system downwards. This is also why people on steroids might get infections or opportunistic infections or secondary infections because steroids would go and suppress the immune system. Now, a person who is under stress is releasing lots of cortisol, which means their immune system isn't working correctly. And ashwagandha is an immune stimulant as well. So, what do we mean by metabolic regulator? It is something that enhances body's ability to adapt to environmental factors and avoid the damage employed by them. So, what kind of things it helps with? So, the list is ashwagandha reduces stress induced, so stress caused. So imagine if I'm under stress, what will be happening in my body? I will be releasing cortisol or steroids, which will in turn cause hyperglycemia. Remember that steroids would cause insulin resistance because one of the function of our stress management system is that when we are under stress, our body tries to keep glucose available to muscle and brain, and it asks everything else not to use glucose. So the result is we get hyperglycemia. This is why people on steroids develop hyperglycemia. So under stress, we have cortisol. Just imagine that ashwagandha would now reverse that. Under stress, we have hyperglycemia. Ashwagandha reverses that. Triglycerides are increased. Epinephrine is increased. Creatinine levels are increased because of the stress on the kidney and stress on the muscles. Interleukin 6 is increased, which would in turn cause the immune system changes. ALT and AST, the liver enzymes, are increased. Gastric ulcers occur. People who are under stress, they start developing stomach burning and the feeling of burning in the chest and discomfort. That is the gastric ulcers because their stomach acids are released more. Sexual dysfunction occurs. Cognitive deficit occurs. Mental depression occurs. Immunosuppression occurs, right? So just a very quick, what is happening to the organs, the depression and cognitive deficit because of the neuronal damage and neuronal misfunction or malfunction. Gastric ulcers are occurring because of the increased secretion of gastric acids, which will then cause even the digestion of the gastric stomach's own walls or downwards duodenum and other intestinal parts and causing damage there and causing ulcers. This is why many times the CEOs of bigger companies or even startups like me, they can get gastric ulcers. Liver inflammation, interleukin 6 present, liver function tests can become, liver enzymes can become dysregulated. The kidney, we can get creatinine increase, which can also is an indication of the creatinine increase by the muscles. Sexual dysfunction can occur. Libido can reduce. The erectile dysfunction can occur. Immune suppression occurs, which is a classic behavior of the steroids. Then, of course, as I said before, hyperglycemia can occur, triglycerides can occur, And look at the diagrams I made today for you. This is the suprarenal gland or adrenal glands. And under stress, pituitary sends a message to adrenal glands to secrete more adrenaline and more cortisol. So this little black monster is adrenaline. It is actually help during fight and flight behavior. But if somebody is under stress for other reasons, there is no reason to run away from a tiger, but the person is still under stress, then this adrenaline that is being produced is actually going to be harmful. And similarly, this helpful molecule, cortisol, when produced in excess, is also going to be harmful. Actually, majority of the things that we just saw above are a response to increased cortisol and epinephrine levels. So then, how will ashwagandha help? So first, for all of those strange dysfunctions that we saw, inside the cells, there are malfunctions happening. Why are these happening? Because of the inflammatory state change, because of the cortisols present, because of the glucose level changes, because of the epinephrine's presence. So there are many stressful triggers that are present. And what they do is that within the cells, the proteins that are present inside the cell, they can, under stress, start becoming denatured. And this can be, for example, let's say hypoxia or less oxygen availability will cause within the cell increase acidity plus reduce ATP production, which will then cause these proteins to become denatured. It's like a fried egg. So if you take an egg and you fry it with heat, what are you doing? You're denaturing it. So within our cells, proteins can become denatured because of heat changes, because of acidic, the pH level changes, because of inflammatory molecules, because of bad enzymes, and so on, because of toxins, because of viruses. So when the cell is under stress because of many of those things, the proteins inside the cell would start becoming denatured. Now, denatured proteins, we have a way to handle them. What we have is we have caspases, we have proteins that can take care of the denatured proteins. However, if these these denatured proteins, they start tangling with each other, they start getting entangled with each other, if they start making aggregates that are kind of rough and tough clumps, then we have a problem. The normal professional services within a cell to correct the proteins or to digest the proteins that have become bad, that normal phenomena, the caspases phenomena, does not work correctly. So the ubiquitination mechanism is when we have a protein, a normal protein, which became, let's say, old and now it is decaying, or had a toxin attack it, or a virus attack that, or a pH change attack it, whatever happened. When that protein has become denatured, then within the cell, we have caspases that will mark this protein to say, hey, we need to remove this protein. I remember caspases by Casper the Friendly Ghost. Once this protein is marked to be removed, then the ubiquitin system comes into action. These are a set of proteins that will pick up this protein and bring it to an endosome or a proteasome, which are the food processors or thrashers within the cell. And they would throw this protein in those endosomes or proteasomes, and these proteasomes are big machines that would break apart this protein and take its components out and will build new proteins. However, when proteins have become jumbled up, they have become tangled up, especially in the neuronal system, in the neurons, that is even bad. When they become tangled up, then the caspase system and ubiquitination system does not work very well. So then we need a different kind of a system. We need chaperone mediated autophagy type systems to help. And for that, we need heat shock proteins. If you have watched my video on autophagy and how does autophagy works, and in there I have talked about the chaperone mediated autophagy, this mechanism is discussed in much more detail. But the summary of that over here is that when we have tangles of proteins, the chaperone mediated proteins would come and help, or heat shock proteins will help. Now, how do these help? What happens is, in this diagram, if you see, this blue protein is an illustration of a heat shock protein. These proteins are actually such a beautiful set of proteins that you can think of those as mothers for the protein within a cell. From the birth of a protein till the death of a protein, heat shock proteins are continuously at service for this protein. And I explained it in the other lecture. Here, the only thing I want to say is that the heat shock proteins will pick up the proteins that are becoming denatured, and they would start incubating them. They would start helping them stay integrated, stay folded, stay in shape, and do not become bad, and do not become disintegrated, and then do not become entangled with other disintegrating proteins. So, can I say over here that if a cell is under stress, and of course, by cell, in today's talk, you can think about neurons. If a cell is under stress and the proteins within the cell are becoming bad, and heat shock proteins can help during the stressful time, then don't you think that we need more heat shock proteins? Think about that, right? So these little incubating proteins. So these proteins, the heat shock proteins, they stabilize the proteins against denaturation and aggregation while the cell is undergoing stress. So I hope that you said, yeah, we need to have more heat shock proteins. If you said that, then here is the answer. How do we get more heat shock proteins? Remember, one way to get more heat shock protein is autophagy by intermittent fasting. Then remember resveratrol, remember coffee. There are many triggers that can produce more heat shock protein. Ashwagandha is one of them. So ashwagandha, what it does is, so if you see here, this is ashwagandha, or my depiction of ashwagandha. Ashwagandha works on our genetic system, our DNA, and helps open up the genes that would produce more heat shock proteins. So we, in simple terms, we can say that ashwagandha would upregulate the production of heat shock protein 70 especially. The heat shock protein 70 and 72 are very popular, especially for their function for helping the protein stay integral and helping them avoid the entanglement and destruction. And heat shock proteins do a lot other things. They help with the trafficking of the protein from one place to another place. They help for folding of the proteins. They help that if a protein is misfolding, they would try to help it to become folded again. So they have a lot of functions. They are heat shock proteins. They are helper proteins. But ashwagandha would increase their number. When the numbers are increased, then within the cell, there are more helpers that would help the poor proteins, these red little proteins that are dying, these would help them stay intact. Now, remember, when we can keep the proteins from dying, then we'll keep the cell from dying as well. Because a cell in which destruction is happening, that cell would probably die by apoptosis if enough destruction has happened and enough internal sensors have triggered and they have told the cell that, hey, we are in trouble. Or if the cell is too much under stress and it cannot really cause apoptosis, it cannot die gracefully, then the immune system would kill it, looking at the abnormality of the cluster of designation proteins on its surface. So cell or neuron in this context of our discussion today is in trouble under stress. And ashwagandha would increase HSP. HSP in turn would get the cell out of trouble. So, in addition to that, when the heat shock proteins increase, they also cause two more pathways to become triggered. One pathway is called JNK pathway. When that pathway within the cell becomes triggered, and there was a complete beautiful set of proteins I could draw for that one as well. I just didn't have enough time. So let's just go with my text now. JNK pathway, when that becomes activated, it helps with the neuronal plasticity. That means that neuron can adapt, plus they can re-establish connections. It helps with the neuronal regeneration. It reduces cell death, neuron death, apoptosis. It reduces cell senescence. So sometimes what happens is when a cell figures out that I can't really survive anymore, then that cell locks itself into a senescent state. It says, I'm not going to divide anymore. I may be damaged and my daughters may become damaged as well. So I am just going to become a permanent cell. So all those cells that are capable of dividing, if they are under stress and if they cannot manage stress, one outcome could be they become senescent, which simply means they become old. They decide to become old and say, we are permanent, we're done. We're not going to have any further daughters. We'll just die when the time comes. JNK pathway prevents all of that. It protects a cell from dying away. Similarly, another pathway, DAF16 FOXO pathway, is also activated by increased heat shock proteins. And who increase the heat shock proteins? Ashwagandha. The DAF16 and FOXO pathway, when that increases, what it does is it helps with the integrates different pathways. So there are other protective pathways. For example, JNK pathway, which we just read, AMPK pathway, TOR pathway, insulin IGF pathway, and even more pathways. They are all going to help a cell be protected. And DAF16 and FOX0 pathway integrates them all. It helps pull their activities together to protect the cell. So, ashwagandha not only triggered the production of heat shock protein, which themselves are helpful, but the production of heat shock protein itself then triggered more pathways that are further helpful. The result is going to be better adaptability, better protection of the neurons, better protection of all cells. So, for example, depression and cognitive deficit will reduce. The production of noradrenaline and cortisol will reduce, which would in turn, of course, cause reduced gastric ulcers. That would cause reduced inflammation and reduce function of the liver and reduce liver enzymes. That would reduce the creatinine. That would reduce the hyperglycemia, because when the cortisol levels are down, insulin resistance becomes less, hyperglycemia would become less, triglycerides will become less, immune system will start becoming rebounded and it would start working correctly, and sexual dysfunction will start going away as well. Beautiful herb. And for anyone who would think of using it, please make sure that there are many, many sites where they talk about the side effects of ashwagandha. They talk about the contraindications of ashwagandha. They talk about the dose of ashwagandha. So make sure that you, number one, become aware of those. Number two, talk with your doctor, and only then add this to your regime, if you will. So I think it's a really, really promising product. Anti-inflammatory, anti-cancer, and anti-adaptogen or anti-stress. Not anti-adaptogen, but adaptogen and anti-stress. Majority of its function, majority of its use has been for stress. Now, very quickly, just 5 more minutes, I want to quickly show you some of the studies that are here. So Here is the study. All the links are in the description of this video. Evidence-based efficacy of adaptogens in fatigue and molecular mechanisms related to their stress protective activity. I'm going to increase the size to see if it becomes a little more readable. So here, hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis, that is the axis that would release eventually cortisol and adrenaline, and the control of key mediators of stress response, such as molecular chaperones, HSP17, heat shock protein 70, stress activated C zone N terminal protein kinase, or JNK, which I talked, fork head box, FOXO0, DAF16, cortisol and nitric oxide. The key point of action of phytoadaptogen. Phytoadaptogen are adaptogen coming from the plants like ashwagandha, appears to be their upregulating and stress mimetic effect on stress sensor protein HSP70. In general, the thing that I just mentioned, that they increase the HSP70, which in turn K plus FOXO0 functions. Adaptogen-induced upregulation of HSP70 triggers stress-induced JNK1 and DF16 mediated pathway, regulating the resistance to stress and so on. So it actually makes a person resilient. So that's one. Then here, heat shock protein as an emerging drug target. So here they're talking about heat shock protein and what's their function. Heat shock protein is a molecular chaperone that is expressed in response to stress. In this role, HSP70 binds to its protein substrates and stabilizes them against denaturation or aggregation until conditions improve. I just discussed that. So then adaptogenic activity of Withenia, somnifera, the same thing. What is that? What we're talking about? An experimental study using a rat model for chronic stress. So in this model, they were giving shock to rats' feet for 21 days. And in one population of the rats, they gave them ashwagandha 1 hour before the shock. And these rats had, so if you see here, the shock induced significant hyperglycemia, glucose intolerance, plasma corticosterone levels, gastric ulcerations, male sexual dysfunction, cognitive deficit, immunosuppression, mental depression. All of them became improved with ashwagandha, while the mice were still going through the shock, but they had become adapted. They kind of were not as worried or nervous with that. The results indicate that ashwagandha, like PG is the ginseng, has significant anti-stress adaptogenic activity, confirming the clinical use of plant in Ayurveda. So then here is another study. In here, what they did was they tried to see that if somebody is taking ashwagandha, so again, rat study, then will they become more resilient for exercises and swimming and others? So the rats were actually able to swim better and exercise better and have better tolerance for hypoxia. Now, the JNK, so this is the C-Jun and terminal kinases, are a family of proteins kinases that play a central role in stress signaling pathway implicated in gene expression, neuronal plasticity, regeneration, cell death, and regulation. So this is just an evidence of my discussion around JNK. And finally, this is the evidence for the discussion around DAF16 and FOXO. And here, dissecting the molecular mechanisms that underlie aging and longevity would contribute to implications for preventing treating the age-dependent diseases or cancers. Multiple signaling pathways, such as the insulin IGF-1 signaling pathway, TOR, AMPK, JNK pathway, and germline signaling, have been found to be involved in aging and longevity. DAF16 FOXO, as a key transcriptor factor, could integrate different signals for these pathways to modulate aging and longevity via shuttling from the cytoplasm to nucleus. What they mean to say is that DAF16 pathway helps. And we just saw that ashwagandha increases HSP increases this pathway, and this pathway would help. So overall, not only that this is helpful for brain and stress, it is actually going to help reduce aging process as well. It helps add longevity. And it is also very important to consider that the aging processes and the anti-longevity processes are also at the root of cancer development. And so this is how it also helps against cancer. And I've done that as a separate discussion. So this is the discussion for today. Thank you very much for listening in. Please like, subscribe, and share. Once again, there are links in the description of this video if you would want to get access to Dr. Bean, where there are tons of other lectures, or if you want to support this work, there are other links in there as well. But easiest is like, subscribe, and share. I would see you tomorrow. Bye for now.